The world of the past was very different from the world of today. From $10,000 fruits to auctioning off spouses, some things that we would see as nuts were simply the norm. So today, buckle up and get ready to hear about some crazy historical facts that are hard to believe are true. And if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. Number 5. Albert Einstein for president? While Lincoln, Attlee, Nehru, and Mandela are all in contention for being the world's greatest ever political leader, there was a very real chance that Albert Einstein could have taken the title. That's because, despite having absolutely zero political experience, in 1952, he was asked to be the president of Israel. You see, Einstein was not only a Zionist, but a friend to Chaim Weizmann, who was the first Israeli president. Thus, after Weizmann died in November of 1952, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was under considerable pressure to give the position to academic superstar Albert Einstein. To be clear, this wasn't as crazy as it sounds. After all, in Israel, it is the Prime Minister who does most of the heavy lifting, since the role of president is mostly ceremonial. As a result, the deal was pretty sweet. So long as Einstein moved to Israel and did the bare minimum in terms of presidential duties, he could continue to do his scientific research and receive considerable funding from the Israeli government. However, while Einstein was deeply touched, he ultimately refused. According to Einstein himself, "All my life I have dealt with objective matters, and hence I lack both the natural aptitude and the experience to deal properly with people and to exercise official function." Number 4. Wife selling. While unthinkable today, from the mid-17th to mid-19th century, it was not uncommon for British men to auction off their wives. Now, we should make it clear that a wife auction couldn't just be called by the husband at random. You see, during this time period, it was nearly impossible for lower-class Britons to divorce. In order to do so, you had to obtain a private act of parliament. In essence, this was an exception to Britain's ultra-conservative divorce laws. Since this was extremely time-consuming and expensive, for many, a public wife sale was the next best alternative. The idea was that by publicly selling off one's wife to another man, the husband would relinquish all civil claims against her in a public setting. Since husbands could financially sue men who slept with their wives, this ceremony created enough legal grounds to ensure that the first husband could not sue his ex-wife's new lovers for adultery. As a result, this quasi-legal ceremony was usually a simple transaction, where the one and only bidder would be the wife's new lover. However, at times, an actual auction would occur. So long as the wife agreed to it, she could be marched out to the town square, described to the men in the crowd, and then sold to the highest bidder. Thankfully, in 1857, more liberal divorce laws were passed, ending this draconian practice. Number 3. The guillotine stuck around for almost 200 years after the French Revolution. When you think of the guillotine, chances are that Marie Antoinette declaring, "Let them eat cake" in the face of starving peasants comes to mind. And while that story probably isn't true, what is certainly true is the fact that the guillotine was a force to be reckoned with in revolutionary France. Sending more than 10,000 people to their graves, this ruthless killing machine made quick work of anyone seen to have royalist sympathies. Strangely enough, this brutal machine was seen as quite humane. After all, it made passing away quick and painless, and as such, it was considered to be more civilized than British methods such as hanging or firing squad. It was perhaps this perceived civility that allowed the guillotine to stick around for almost 200 years after the French Revolution. You see, the last person to fall victim to it was a certain Tunisian named Hamida Jandoubi. The story goes that in 1968, Jandoubi moved to Marseille, and in 1974, he kidnapped, tortured, and murdered 22-year-old Elizabeth Bousquet. When brought to trial in 1977, the public was outraged, and he was ultimately sentenced to death. Later that year, he was speedily dispatched by way of the guillotine. Now, whether or not you agree with that sentence, the fact of the matter is that this barbaric execution machine is now only found in museums. That's because, in 1981, capital punishment was abolished in France, making Jandoubi the last person to be executed in Western Europe, and the last to be lawfully executed by beheading anywhere in the Western world. Number 2. Pineapples for rent. If you want to feel like an 18th century aristocrat, pick up a pineapple from your local grocery store. That's because, from around the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s, pineapples were considered to be one of the classiest and most exclusive items around. During this time period, getting your hands on a pineapple was like getting a COVID vaccine in 2020. In other words, almost impossible. That's because they had to be imported from tropical areas, and due to distance and temperature constraints, they would usually become bruised and rotten en route. As a result, pineapples in presentable condition became more hyped up than NFTs were in 2021. first gracing the tables of monarchs such as Louis XV, Catherine the Great, and Charles II. They were generally used as a centerpiece rather than eaten. In fact, they would usually only be cut open for consumption when they were about to go bad. That's because, even for the likes of kings and queens, they generally cost north of the modern-day equivalent of $10,000, with this number becoming a slightly more reasonable $8,000 in the American colonies, which were somewhat closer to the tropics. As you might imagine, entrepreneurs soon began to attempt to grow pineapples in Europe. While an abject failure at first due to the continent's cold spells, some pineapple planters finally began to have success by creating hothouses. These attempted to mimic the conditions of the tropics by increasing the humidity and temperature within a confined space. However, these hothouses did not come without risk. After all, not only would it cost the modern equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars to set one up, but the heating came from furnaces whose fumes would often kill the pineapple plants before they reached maturity. Since it generally took years for pineapples to be produced, the chances of something going wrong were quite high. All of these risks and costs meant that very few people could actually afford to own a pineapple. As a result, many would simply rent them for a night, displaying them at their table or walking around with them in order to give the illusion of having the wealth of a true pineapple owner. However, as steamships became more prominent, pineapples became more common. By the mid-1800s, even working-class people could afford them, thus putting luxury pineapple merchants out of business. Number 1. Animals on trial. While it may seem ridiculous today, until the 18th century, it was commonplace for animals to be put on trial for crimes. Ranging from theft to murder, generally speaking, the animals were treated a lot like humans. Arrested and sent to a secular court, evidence for and against their innocence would be presented, and oftentimes, they would receive the same punishments as humans. Pigs were the most common example. Since they were often allowed to run free on the streets, they would from time to time commit human crimes. Documents attest to pigs chewing off ears, biting off noses, and even killing children, with these crimes often resulting in the offending pig being hanged or burned to death. And while the whole thing may sound absolutely ridiculous, these trials were taken very seriously. Take a trial from September 5th of 1379 as an example. The story goes that after growing agitated, 2 herds of pigs at a French monastery killed a man named Perrenot Muet. As a result, both the actual pigs and the pigs that had simply looked on were tried collectively for their horrible crime. According to court documents, the whole herd was guilty of murder, as even those who had not participated had with their, quote, cries and aggressive actions, showed that they approved of the assault, end quote. However, they had one saving grace, the monastery's prior, Friar Humbert de Poitiers. Since he couldn't afford to lose all of those pigs, he wrote to the Duke of Burgundy, begging for him to pardon the onlookers and only allow the 3 murderous pigs to be sentenced. The Duke agreed, and after he, quote, lent a gracious ear to his supplication and ordered that the punishment should be remitted and the swine released, end quote, the trial was over. While this may seem crazy enough, some trials reached whole new levels of absurdity. That's because in the 16th century, trials were conducted against pests like rats, locusts, and weevils. In one such trial, the immortal public defender, Bartholomew Chassenet, was tasked with defending an unspecified number of rats that had eaten up the barley crop of the French province of Autun. In what can only be described as a genius bit of lawyering, he argued it was impossible to summon all of his furry clients to court due to, among other things, their advanced age, many only live for a year or 2, and the threat of cats eating them on the way to the courtroom. Believe it or not, this ridiculous defense worked, and the case was dismissed. Thankfully, common sense eventually began to prevail. People began to realize that animals do not have free will in the same way that humans do, and that sentencing them to death, or in some cases excommunication from heaven, was downright absurd. So what do you guys think? Is this a solid list, or are there some even crazier facts that we left out? Let us know in the comments down below. And for more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.